available from next week.
Thank you. You've kept nurseries open. Will nurseries be staying open? And can you confirm that they are safe for staff who work there, who are doing so much to keep those children learning, and for children?
Nurseries, we always, Mr. Chairman, I'm very much like you. I always want to see all education settings open all the time. I always want to ensure that every child is in a position to be able to go to school. And as you'll be aware, that the transmissibility among those who are most youngest is actually the very lowest compared to all of the settings. So when you're in a position to be able to keep part of the education sector open in terms of early years, I believe it was the right decision to make, because so many families really rely on that nursery provision. But most importantly, those early years are so important.
And are you going to keep them open? They're not going to guaranteed.
The advice that we've had from is that we can keep early year settings open, and we have there's no intention to close them, and we've not received any contrary advice to that.
Thank you. If I can just turn on to mental health, could I ask, is the DfE carrying out any audit on the impact of lockdowns and school closures on pupils' mental health? And what is the government doing to ensure that pupils have adequate access to mental health support while schools are closed? You will have heard the evidence from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Paediatricians, and just last week, Dr. Karen Street, an officer at the Royal College of Paediatrics, wrote harrowingly about the 400% increase in eating disorders amongst young people, partly due to school closures and social isolation. So can you guarantee that mental health professionals will be put in schools, and that parents and children who are at home in social isolation can have access to those professionals whenever they need it?
I think all members of your committee, and actually much more wider in society, we've all had to deal with either, sort of with loved ones or people that are close to us, issues to deal with mental health. And what we have seen during the pandemic, it has put quite extraordinary strain on so many young people and families. And I'd like to pay tribute to the work that has been undertaken by the Department for Health. The fact that, a £2.3 billion investment in mental health. And this is about how we bring together both education and health services locally to make sure we deliver the best mental health support that is possible. We had the Wellbeing for Education Return programme, which actually was an investment in terms of training for teachers and those who work in schools and colleges to best be able to help young people, as well as those who work in education, to support them with the mental health issues that they may have. But I've also asked the Minister for Universities and the Minister for Children to convene a task force to look at some of the real issues that children are having to deal with, and also professionals within the sector, both within schools, in colleges, in nurseries, and of course universities, about how the government can best respond to some of these real challenges that we're dealing with on mental health.
But would an answer just be, because we know it's a serious problem and getting worse, sadly, just to have either incredible organisations and charities like Places to Be, for example, that the government supports, for children and parents to be able to have access to a mental health counsellor in their school whenever they need it, especially during lockdown, because that would make possibly a huge difference to families that are struggling?
Well, that's very much where the Wellbeing for Education Return programme was aimed at, in terms of giving people teaching staff the training in order to be able to deliver that support at source. And of course, having children back in schools was an incredibly important moment in order to be able to spot some of the challenges. And that's why I'm so keen to ensure that schools are closed for the shortest time possible, because it doesn't just help children in their educational attainment, but it also helps them in their physical and mental well-being, being in school as well. But we're looking right across the spectrum as to how we can leverage in as much mental health support for children. This is why I've asked both Michelle and Vicky to look right across the whole education sectors, looking at what more that we can be doing and bringing in those important partners. And you're absolutely right to highlight the voluntary sector, who do such excellent work in there. And we've continued to support so many children's charities through financial support, who are so vital in terms of helping and supporting children in their mental health and well-being. But we do want to look at how we can step that up.
Thank you. I hope you'll consider that, and that'll happen quickly. Could I just ask you, given that you have rightly said that you want the schools to open again as soon as possible, ideally after the half term, and I hope that's signed in blood, with all the activities and investment the government is doing in terms of testing regarding children and teachers, surely it might be better to put that investment into rolling out vaccines for teachers and support staff, and perhaps having mobile vans, a bit like the blood donor vans, as much as possible, go up and down schools vaccinating teachers and support staff, because that would be one way that teachers wouldn't feel at risk, but more importantly, we could get our schools open again sooner rather than later.
So you're right to highlight there's been a lot of focus on testing, and testing will continue to remain really important part of supporting children in education, because as you are aware, Mr. Chairman, that there hasn't been a completed trial on children, people under the age of 18 on any of the vaccines. So we aren't going to be in a position to be able to offer vaccinations for children until there have been those fully completed trials. So testing is going to remain important, because actually we've already seen with the rollout of testing, we've already had hundreds of thousands of tests completed for those children who are attending schools and for those staff.
But why not make sure that teachers are on, not because one favours one group of workers over another, I completely get that, and it's always going to be very difficult who you choose. Why not ensure that teachers are a priority, teachers and support staff are a priority for vaccination, so then we get our schools open? And there's how many, there's 450,000 teachers roughly. So, if you spent a few days doing that, given that the capacity now is 200 every couple of days, you could get teachers and support staff done pretty quickly.
So, Mr. Chairman, there's a total, there's a school workforce of 1 million, and it's absolutely vital we do not forget support staff in this, because it is often the support staff who will often be the ones who are often the most exposed. And I think there's also a special need in the area of special schools as well, where there is often a crossover between not just as an education setting, but also as a care and health setting as well. It is quite understandably right that the government has decided to prioritise those who are most at risk of being hospitalised, and as a result of catching COVID, most at risk of death. But as the Health Secretary and as Nadeem has also said, in that next wave where we need to prioritise others, I will make no apology for the fact that I see the top priority is for all those who work in schools, not just teachers, but all those who work in schools, because every single one of them is absolutely vital for delivering education.
Thank you. I hope that we can get and I always say support staff, and I'm glad that you mentioned support staff too, because they're often forgotten about, and people just talk about teachers. Just before I carry on, Tom Hunt wants to ask a question about vaccinations.
Good morning, Secretary of State. I'm aware that there's a letter sent to you recently by, I think it was HMC, and I have a school in my constituency who's working with other schools who feels as though it has the facilities and also the trained staff to be able to vaccinate all of the local teaching staff in the area. So it would simply be a matter of getting them the vaccine, but they'd be able to take care of everything else without detracting away from the other wider vaccination strategies. So I just wondered what your thoughts were. If you have, I think that letter was actually sent pretty recently, so I don't know if you've, but firstly, what your thoughts are on that, because it does seem like a lot of the schools really are prepared to roll their sleeves up and be part of, getting teachers vaccinated.
Concisely, if you can.
Of course. Tom, as I'm sure, I haven't actually seen the letter, but I will make sure it's dug out immediately. Obviously, the JCVI have set out those who are most at risk of death and most at risk of harm, and so they have to be the top priority. I want to see my priority is to see teachers, support staff be in the place to be able to get the vaccine at the very earliest moment. And I agree with you. I think there is a real appetite and there is a real ability, as we've already seen with testing, that schools can play a major role in the rollout, not just of testing, but in terms of vaccination, making sure we get to that position where we're protecting that really, really critical workforce that's so vital for all of us, but most importantly, so vital for our children.
Yeah. So it's good to confirm that you are fighting that teachers and support staff get moved up the priority list for vaccinations.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely tooth and nail. It's the thing that I have conversations with every single day. But Tom, on your point, I'd be very happy to sort of meet up with yourself just to have a bit of a discussion in detail on the back of that letter.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions before I pass to my colleagues. I just want to talk about disengagement from learning and vulnerable pupils. We know that before the most recent lockdown, overall truancy rates almost doubled in autumn 2020. Average absent rates in the recent autumn term was 4.4%, which rose to 8.5% in late November. And that's after COVID-related absences were factored in. Wraparound access to social services diminished during the lockdown. Children's social care teams received 18% fewer referrals than in the same period over the prior 3 years. My concern is that the lockdown could further exacerbate a rise in disengagement seen during the autumn term, and that fewer children will be able to access local support services. COVID aside, what is the department's plan to re-engage learners who are falling off the radar, and how will you support multi-agency working at a local level?
So I think we'd all say that COVID has created enormous challenges for every sector, certainly, and not least education. But there are sometimes good things that can start to emerge from this. One of the things that has really started to emerge is a much closer working between schools, social services and local authorities, but also the police forces in local areas, and how they're actually engaging together in terms of actually working together to have a constant dialogue, constant communication, constant support with children. The initial data that we've already seen starting to come in from just the first day of this week is we've seen a much higher level of children with social workers in school than we saw last time. We saw a variability of between 4 and 28% of children who had a social worker in schools in the last term, in the first lockdown where schools were closed. This time, and it's still too low. That's at 40%. We have a clear strategy in terms of working with local authorities, with our REACT teams, supplementing and supporting local authorities with Ofsted in terms of helping them if they need extra support in order to be able to reach out to most vulnerable children. But there is a bigger issue in terms of long-term engagement. And you've highlighted it as to the fact that there are more of those children who weren't attending school when schools were fully up and running with all year groups invited. This is where it becomes really important in terms of getting the discipline and behaviour structures right within schools and making sure that all schools have really strong policies in terms of truancy, and making sure that there's an exceptionally low tolerance level of truancy within schools, and how we best support schools in order to be able to implement that. So those who are most vulnerable recognise the school is there, it's the safest place for them, and it's the best place for them.
Just we know that in the last lockdown, just 6% of vulnerable children attended school. I'm talking about the main lockdown starting last March. And last week, am I correct in saying that the department suspended the attendance data collection they've run since last April? If that is so, it means it won't be possible to assess whether schools are being inundated with pupils, as many that are claiming. Will the publication of this data resume so that we can find out what is exactly happening to vulnerable children, whether or not they're attending school?
Of course, Mr. Chairman, and we obviously, in terms of the changed circumstances, we had to change the way that we were collecting data, as it wouldn't be reflective of the circumstances that schools found themselves in. And just this morning, we made an ad hoc release of data, which I think is to give people a clear sense of where things were on the first full sort of the first full day of collecting that data. It was, as I just referred to, 40% of children with EHCP plans were in attendance, 46% in primaries, 25% in secondaries, 29% in special schools, and 36% in alternative provision. 40% of children with social workers were in attendance. So as you can see, a much higher rate than last time, but recognising that there is still much more work to do. And the overall attendance rate, sorry, Mr. Chairman, the overall attendance rate was 14% of pupils were in school.
Thank you. I'm very happy if you call me by my first name, by the way. Just finally, I just want to ask you about alternative provision. Can you confirm that alternative provision is obliged to stay open for all of their pupils during lockdown? And if there is no obligation to do so, are they allowed to stay open to all pupils, even if some are not on the vulnerable critical workers list? And just finally, the government softened the requirement in the last lockdown for councils to support pupils of the HCP plans, and can you confirm whether you're doing the same this time?
So in terms of, it's really important. As I said in my statement yesterday, we do. As I said in my statement last week, we do ask. Parents are in a position to be able to keep their children at home. We do ask them to keep their children at home, but if they're in a position where that isn't possible, if they're a critical worker or they're a vulnerable child, we do want to see those sort of places made available to them. And we hadn't got any plans in terms of changing the
You're not going to soften the requirement on the EHCP as happened last time?
There's no intention of doing that.
And AP, are they going to be obliged to stay open for all their pupils or not?
Yeah, and we are asking AP to stay open, and we've seen already in the first cut of data that we've had is that, sorry, if I just sort of look through the, I just try and find the exact data on the AP opening. Sorry, I do apologise.
Just to say the AP, you can send us the data, but just to...
24%, as I say, 24% are attending an alternative provision. And what we're asking is alternative provision is to work with parents and children. Is it open
to all of their pupils or just critical workers and
Well, it's open to all those with an EHCP plan, which obviously is a very high proportion, but we're asking them to work with parents where there is a very specific need in order for them to be able to do that, and to work with parents to work with the need of a child if that needs to be made available to them. And in many cases,
I think that Susan wants to say something.
Of course, yes.
Yes, Secretary of State, sorry, I hope it's helpful. I think the first thing to understand is the definition of vulnerable children is one where we give some discretion to the school, because we think they have the best understanding of which children are most vulnerable. And that means that for AP, that open for all children with ECHPs and all those that they deem vulnerable. And for many AP settings, that will be all the children in the school. But we've also offered them some flexibility to work with parents, because again, they understand their children and their parents well, and they understand what's going to work for them. And so many settings talk to us about the value of being able to design patterns with parents, actually as AP settings do quite a lot of the time in normal times, to try and manage patterns of attendance that are going to work and keep the largest possible number of those children engaged. So yes, they can open for all their children, but they can also design sensible patterns of attendance with pupils and parents that are going to make sense for them and for their cohort.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in David Johnston now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. In September, the department issued a tier system to manage school openings, where you could move from having a rota for different children to attend school at different times through to wholly online learning. Whose decision was it to move away from that system, and why was it taken?
Well, the decision to move away from that system was obviously done in conjunction with Department for Health, Public Health England, and also through the formal process of the COVID-0 committee that obviously convenes all parts of government. We in terms of the sort of design of these systems, these are never done in isolation purely with the Department for Education. It's actually done most critically and importantly with the Department for Health and Public Health England to make sure it sort of meets the need. And what we were finding is that in terms of working with the Department for Health and Public Health England, we felt by moving to the contingency framework, we felt that this would be a better way of doing it. And actually having spoken with the sector and their experiences of operating schools throughout the first few weeks, through the June and July period and then into the September, we felt that, and with the full opening of schools, it felt the contingency framework best met their needs, and it also worked best with the Department for Health and Public Health England.
And is that what you, before I go on to my other questions, is that what you imagine we will revert to when schools come to reopen?
Yeah, so we already have the sort of set scheme in terms of a contingency framework. Obviously, where I would, as I've said many times before, I want schools to be closed for the shortest period of time available, but the contingency framework would be sort of sat there as, if to sort of continue, if there are areas of particular need where we had to have school settings continue to remain closed, it would be through the contingency framework that they would remain closed.
Okay. You issued a temporary continuity direction to Greenwich Council on the 13th of December, and I happen to support your determination to keep schools open, but people have understandably asked on what basis you made that decision, given where we find ourselves now with children having to use online learning anyway.
Yeah. So David, it was, as you can imagine, right across the north of England, right across the Midlands, we've seen many local authorities and many schools having to really tackle very high levels of COVID infections. And what's happened on every one of those occasions, we've been in a situation where we've worked really closely with those local authorities where they've had particular concerns. And we've dealt with dozens of local authorities where they've had particular concerns, and we've never been in a situation where we've had to move a direction, because what's always happened is those local authorities have come to us, we've had detailed discussions, we've looked at working with Public Health England, working with a local director of public health as to how we deal with some of those challenges. Sometimes that's meant schools closing where there's been particular challenges, but we've really taken the approach of partnership working. And you know, you've had areas of a country with case rates of over 800, whereby working with the local authority, we've been in a position where we've been able to keep schools open and protect children's education. What we had in the situation with Greenwich is, you know, there was no conversation, there was no discussion that Greenwich had flagged up an issue beforehand. And, you know, usually these have been flagged up by the directors of children's services, directors of public health. This hadn't been the situation in Greenwich. And we found out by, you know, a sort of clear announcement that this was the approach that Greenwich was taking when they had a case rate load of, you know, 250 per 100,000, which wasn't that different from the all London case rate, and it certainly wasn't one of the areas that had been flagged up to us by Public Health England or anyone else. We're obviously also in a position where the knowledge of a new variant was certainly not something that we had any understanding and knowledge of. And you'd seen authorities and schools right across the north of England, right across the Midlands, being in a position where we'd had this amazing partnership working, where we'd worked together, dealing with some really tricky issues and case rates much higher than we're seeing in Greenwich, and being in a position where children were able to continue to get in education. So it would have been remiss of us, and it would have been wrong of us not to take action where there was a local authority where case rates were just so much lower than all those other local authorities right across the north, right across the Midlands, where we'd had that partnership working together to keep schools open, but taking action where was necessary to help them and support them in the containment of the virus. As I say, at that stage, none of us were aware of the new variant, and we were not aware of the impact that that would ultimately have in terms of case rates and the impact more widely right across the country and including in London.
Okay, thank you. Could you just quickly describe for us how hotspots are brought to your attention as Secretary of State?
Well, of course, we have a very detailed bronze, silver and gold command structure that is run by the Department for Health, where local authorities, directors of public health in those local authorities, regional directors of public health, the NHS, and you know, obviously the Department for Health and Social Care and other interests are sort of represented on there, and that is the mechanism that it would be flagged up. But also we have a lot of dialogue with local authorities who, as I say, in so many cases that we'd seen from all the way from June all the way through December, where local directors of public health were having regular discussions with regional schools commissioners, highlighting where they had concerns, and we were taking action wherever we could do to help support them in terms of tackling COVID.
Okay, and last question from me for now, which is more a long-term one. What's your assessment of what we've been through with education in the last year, the impact it's going to have on the disadvantage gap? Because some estimates say it's going to wipe out the progress we've made in closing the disadvantage gap of the last decade. I mean, what's your view of the damage that this is going to have done?
I think the DfE official said the attainment gap could be as much as 75% between disadvantaged pupils and their better off peers once COVID is out of the way.
This will be one of the greatest challenges that we face over the coming years, and how we take the action to make sure that this pandemic does not hold back the progress of children from whatever background that they come from. we are got to ensure that this pandemic does not scar the lives of children we've got to take every action that we can do to really, we saw that with the COVID catch-up fund. We're seeing that with the national tutoring programme. We must not rest in terms of doing everything we can do to be closing that disadvantage gap. And this is why I will never make an apology for being the greatest champion of opening schools, because actually all the interactions that we know make the greatest progress and have the greatest impact on children mean that schools are open and children are in the classroom. And that is why I must never apologise for being the greatest champion of keeping schools open, because I know it makes such a big impact, and it makes the biggest impact to the children from the most disadvantaged. But where we take action, it has to be evidence-based. This is why schemes such as the National Tutoring Programme, when we roll out further initiatives, whether that is, sort of more support to ensure that and support learning through the summer for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, these are the actions that we will have to undertake, because we know that they can make a real difference to children's lives, and we must be relentless in
okay.
To close that gap.
Thank you. You've been great with the old concise answers, Secretary of State. If you just keep it up, it would be appreciated.
I will endeavour to be more concise.
Thank you. Ian, before I bring in John Gullis, Ian has a question on truancy. Ian Mearns, please.
Truancy, Secretary of State. I mean, the trouble is, it's how we couch this in language, because there's attendance and there's absenteeism or non-attendance. And, I think the general understanding of the bulk of the population of truancy is where children are bunking off without their parents' understanding or knowledge. Whereas, there is an awful lot of absenteeism which has been occurring within the current context, which has been either parentally condoned or parentally supported. And I'm just wondering, have you done any sort of analysis of what the attendance rates have been and how much actual truancy there has been where kids are bunking off without their parents knowing? Because I think that's important in terms of understanding the problem that we've got to deal with in terms of getting kids back into the classroom. And the second part is, what's being done to support the learning of children who don't currently have a school role? In other words, they've been off-rolled by a previous school, or they've never got onto a school role in areas of high demand, which is still the case with some children in some parts of the country.
Ian, really important points. And actually, the only way we can get to a solution is schools play a vital role in it, but it has got to be a collaborative approach across all agencies. And we often fall into the habit of saying this is purely a school problem. Actually, the consequences of that long-term absenteeism, either by sort of almost, parents not being the driver to make sure their children are attending school, or where it's happening without the parents' knowledge. The only way we can really tackle this, yes, schools play an absolute pivotal part in it, but it is working. It's really also working with local authorities. It's working with the police, but it's social care. But it's also working with health as well, who will often have a sort of a good picture of sometimes family circumstances, especially of those children in the earliest years. What we're going to we're working with local authorities in terms of providing the data of where there is that absenteeism. So actually, by providing that data, obviously it's held by the schools, but it's really important to share that data across with local authorities, who again have some of the levers to be able to work and have an understanding of how we can tackle this challenge together. And we're working on the sharing that data in future releases going forward again, so local authorities have the tools to do the job, and we'll be looking at publishing that data for the autumn term on the 19th of January. So not too far away, and I think that will be I think it gives a sort of really important insight and a really important tool. But I think longer term, we mustn't be we mustn't be neglectful of the real challenge that we're going to have to face in terms of how this cross-government working is going to have to do. And family hubs, I think, are going to play a really important part in actually tackling some of that disengagement.
Thank you. Jonathan Gullis, you're on a train, so if you cut off, we'll bring you back later on. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State.
Well, I'm going to, I could maybe make up Jonathan's question at this point.
Jonathan, if you text me the questions, if you can't, if the internet connection isn't good.
I would not going to go beyond.
It's not working, unfortunately, Jonathan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to, I'd like to move to Christian, please. And we'll come back to Jonathan if you can get an internet connection.
Thank you, Chair. It's difficult to follow that. Good morning, Secretary of State. In regards to the decision that was made in regards to mass testing of secondary schools, for many schools, this was taken up on the last day of term. Some schools had already broken up by that point. So in regards to the decision, why was it thought that was an appropriate time to make that decision, and why was the announcement not brought forward or put back, so it allowed more time to one, be understood, but actually to be implemented fairly?
So as you'll appreciate, I think all members of the committee will appreciate it, in any global pandemic, things move at incredible speed, and we were in a situation where we could be able to, at that stage, make an offer to school that wasn't going to be a compulsory offer, but it was an option that they could take up in terms of testing. And obviously, we wanted to be able to get that offer out at the very earliest stage. I very much recognise that that is not the time that any school wants to be able to get that type of information. It's not the situation we ever wish to be in. But we were in a place where we were going to be able to offer them a full testing regime that they're able to take up. We were going to be in a position to be able to offer the financial support for them to be able to roll it out. And it felt the right thing to be able to do, because there was, of course, by that time, and I'm sure you're aware, the Health Secretary had, by that stage, made a statement to the House of Commons about the emergence of a new variant. And it felt that it was going to be an important tool in terms of supporting schools, supporting workforce, and most importantly, in supporting pupils in order for them to be able to get back into education at the earliest possible stage.
Thank you, Secretary of State. In regards to those areas that had high prevalence of the virus prior to the lockdown, I think predominantly of the Northwest, the Midlands, for example, where before the second lockdown we were up to over 600 cases per 100,000. At any point during that surge, was there a push from the department to try to implement mass testing in schools? And if so, what was the Department for Health's response in regards to that?
So we've been wanting to roll out mass testing at a very early stage, and we have we've seen mass testing rolled out in schools in a number of areas. The first one, of course, was Liverpool as part of that, and schools played a really important part of that community mass testing response. What we did following that is we quite understandably did an extensive number of pilots across the country in very different types of schools, in very different types of areas. Because obviously, if you're wanting to roll out a mass testing program, we wanted to see as to whether it was feasible and whether that would deliver the results that were of value to public health. and also worked for the schools. The pilots that we ran across the country came to a conclusion at the close end of that term, which meant that that was the first time that we were then in a position to be able to start to roll out, start to look feasibly at the rollout of mass testing, because we obviously had to test those pilots, see what worked for the schools, see what worked for pupils, and whether it's feasible to do it. We found out that it was, and the evidence from the first week or more of schools operating testing regimes, we've already had hundreds of thousands of positive tests, hundreds of thousands of tests come back of testing children. So it does show this is a system that can work in both schools and colleges.
Thank you. In regards to the testing, obviously it's very helpful to be rolled out to secondary, but the number of secondary schools, but the number of children who've missed days of education, not just in the secondary setting, but in further education, in primary education, and in early years education. What thought is there to actually extending mass testing to cover all education settings and not just secondary? So
the mass testing already includes further education colleges, and part of the drop of tests, it wasn't just to secondary schools, it was to all education establishments, secondary and further education colleges and sixth form colleges as well. They all have received the initial drop of tests on the Monday, the 4th of January, with further tests coming forward. I want to see mass testing rolled out across all education settings. On the next, what we're seeing from, the 18th of January, you're going to see the rollout of staff testing for primary school teachers. Testing is a really important part of bringing children back into school. It's also a really important part of not just making schools as safe as possible, but actually fighting against COVID right across the community. Because if we're testing a child, in essence, we're also in a position where we're testing a household as well. I think...
In a nutshell, are you going to extend it to non-secondary school settings as well?
Well, we've already extended it to further education colleges and sixth form colleges. We're extending the parental testing, the staff testing as of next week to primary schools, and I would like to see it sort of rolled out to all pupils. That's my ambition. That's where I want us to get to.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. Have you got any more questions?
Yeah, one final one, Chair. I mean, given the call on teachers and support staff time in the classroom, obviously teaching those children who are in school, but also providing education for those who are out of school in regards to virtual lessons. What extra resources are being given to schools to actually carry out the mass testing on a weekly basis?
So where we're moving to in terms of the testing of staff in primary schools, these will be tests that teachers will be able to do at home. So they'll be then in a position of actually they'll be able to be self-administered at home for the teachers and support staff to be able to do. In terms of the rollout of the mass testing, there's a £78 million package and being able to support schools in terms of doing that, as well as other additional support that we've put in place.
Thank you. I've got a quick question from Dr. Caroline Johnson before we bring in Ian. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. Two questions very quickly in relation to some of the answers you just gave to Christian. Firstly, you talked about a £78 million package to support schools in terms of delivering these tests. You also talked about how it's fighting COVID right across the community, but these tests are voluntary. Why has the package not been given to support independent schools in delivering what is a health rather than educational measure to ensure that every school participates and we protect all children regardless of their parents' educational choices from these health challenges, which when health is free at the point of use?
Of course. Now, if I can bring Susan in, but just to add that we're actually supporting all education settings, including private schools, with the provision of all the testing kit and all the equipment as well. But if I could just bring the Permanent Secretary in, who just wanted to make a point and also pick up a little bit more on what you just asked. Susan.
Thank you, Secretary of State. So it was really in relation to the last question to say that rolling out testing in primary schools, we're working very closely with PHE, with Test and Trace, and actually with the MHRA, because for primary pupil testing, being able to administer getting to the point where parents can administer the tests at home unlocks the ability to do primary testing at a much greater scale in a way that is more straightforward, but also we think is more appropriate for primary school children. It was just that point that I was going to add. On the independent schools, just to say they are getting the provision of all of the test kits and materials. The aspect of support they don't get is the support for staffing. And of course, that's consistent with the fact that we wouldn't pay for independent school staff for any other purpose.
Is that entirely accurate? Because I could just say, well, if you were delivering the vaccination schedule for senior school pupils, perhaps girls, to have the Cervarix vaccine for HPV, then the NHS does provide that service, and that's why I was raising this as a slightly odd thing that a health provision isn't being provided to all students, regardless of parents' ability to pay for it. The other question I had was really about the primary school rollout, because as a paediatrician, I'm aware that performing tests on older children is significantly easier usually than performing tests on younger children. And yes, the tests are very easy to perform. I have a box in my own house to do as an NHS worker. What's your plans for trying to ensure that younger children particularly can be tested? Because obviously having a teacher trying to do a whole row of them would seem to be incredibly difficult. But when I spoke to the primary heads of my local primary schools, they had very mixed feelings about whether they should be done in schools or by parents.
So I don't think it would be right or appropriate to ask school staff. Obviously, in a secondary setting, staff are supervising the test done by pupils, whereas it's not going to be in a primary school setting. If you try to have a similar approach, you'd be having to ask staff to do the testing themselves, and I just do not believe that's appropriate or right. So what we'd be looking at doing is having a system where it is tests that would be carried out by the parents on their child, as against asking staff to do it, and that would have to take place in the home. Susan, I'm not sure if there's anything further you wanted to add on that.
Only two things on that. So the first thing is that's something that we are going to pilot before we roll it out fully, in order to look at some of the issues around making sure that it's possible for parents to do that and that we can understand test fidelity and other issues. And we're working, as I say, with PHE, Test and Trace, and with the MHRA on that. I think the other thing that's worth saying is if you go for a PCR test in a community testing centre, then for primary age children, the procedure there is that a parent performs the test on the child. So a parent swabs the child. They do it under supervision, but it's, in a sense, this is consistent with the position on other testing.
Thank you.
I'm just going to, Ian, Fleur has a question on testing. So Fleur, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask about the early years sector. You haven't mentioned them in the testing regime, and I think anyone watching will be wondering if where they are in it, and there is confusion at a council level. So can you confirm that the early years sector, state-maintained nurseries, private nurseries and childminders will be included in the testing regime at the same time as other teachers? Thank you.
Well, they're very much included as part of a community testing programme. Obviously, where schools have nurseries as part of them, that will be part of the sort of school staff. But one of the key parts of a community testing programme will be actually ensuring early years workforce have access to that testing.
So will that be at the same time as other teachers?
That will be at the same time as the rollout of the community testing programme, which was announced the other day.
Thank you. Fleur, are you okay?
Well, it's just that certainty that they're seen as a parity of other teachers, like state-maintained nurseries that just happen to not be attached to a school, but they don't seem to be considered in the same tranche as other nursery teachers, and there's a bit of confusion there. So
So the whole community testing program was making sure that we actually pick up the early years settings, because we recognise how important it is. And as you'll be as aware as I am, there's such a range in terms of the numbers of staff and the ability to sort of reach them, because obviously you have some nurseries that are very large, others that are very, very small and almost, one or two people operating them. So it was felt the best way of being able to reach that whole breadth of them was through the community testing program and be able to deliver testing through that.
Okay, I just think that needs to be clarified at a council level, because it's leading to confusion about whether nursery school teachers are included in nurseries and state, private and...
I'll certainly take on board the task and task officials to make sure that that's clarified with local authorities. Obviously, as I say, through many of sort of educational establishments in terms of a rollout of school testing, there's an ability to pick up a lot of nursery settings as part of that, but there'll be a number that we need to have a community testing program in order to be able to pick those settings up for us.
Okay, thank you for taking that up, Secretary of State.
Thank you. Ian, who's been waiting very patiently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Secretary of State, in answer to my earlier question, I don't think you really covered the issue about off-road children. I was wondering if you could write to us about that in more detail in terms of what's actually happening in terms of provision for off-road or children without an allocated school place, which there are still some around the country from last September. If you could maybe let us know what's happening about them.
Of course, I would more than happily write to you, but in detail on that important issue.
Right. Secretary of State, what practical help and support are you providing teachers and school staff during this unprecedented time? Particularly, what access have teachers, support staff and pupils to mental health support? And I'm really, we've covered pupils earlier on, but I'm not sure if we looked at, the support that the teaching staff and school staff in general would have during this time. And there's an additional reason I'm asking that question, because since the new lockdown, I am certainly aware in my own locality of a massive additional stress being placed on teaching staff and management staff in terms of having to allocate the places which are available. Because if we're going to be successful about managing social distancing with the children who are allowed to come to school, there are huge demands from parents and, of course, from vulnerable children as well, in order to come and get those places which might be available. But it seems to me that if we acceded to all of that demand, it would defeat the object of social distancing in the classroom and in the school context, because, frankly, some schools in my area are reporting that 85% of the children, the parents are asking for places because they're key workers or they're vulnerable children, they haven't got a device or all the rest of it. So that's an additional stress. So what are we providing in terms of that support for teaching staff and for staff in schools? And what are we going to do about that real tension there? Because as Susan pointed out before, there is a lot of discretion being given to schools over that, but that's an additional management burden and real demand from parents demanding basically that children be allowed in.
Well, I think we need to be guided by the clear data that's emerging, and in terms of attendance rates nationally, they're running at from the initial cut of data that we've shared today, that's running at 14%. You're right to highlight there will be particular areas where they're actually close to a hospital, close to critical industry, where there are a much higher rates. And what we want to do is work with regional schools commissioners, work with those schools as how best we can support those schools in order to be able to support those children, either they're vulnerable children, they're the children of critical workers, to be best able to support them, to be able to be in the classroom if that's where they need to be. And we'll work right across the sector, both with, as I say, not just with the schools directly, but also with unions as to head teachers unions and everyone else as to how best we can put the support there for schools to be able to manage that. And actually also with local authorities, where there may be particular challenges within local authorities, and actually you know, one of the great things about our education system is the amazing spirit of collaboration between schools, where sometimes there's an element of rivalry, but equally there's more often not a clear understanding of actually how one another plays an important role of supporting the other. You raise a really important issue again about mental health. When we had rolled out the Wellbeing for Education return training, it was really important to pick up staff as well as pupils. And we've also funded some additional education support for mental health needs of school leaders, because the real heroes, head teachers have been amazing heroes during this pandemic. They've not had really any respite at any moment through this, from the moment that schools first had to make those changes back in March, through the holidays, getting ready for a full return in September, and having to continue to deal with those challenges. So we have recognised some of that need, and 85% of local authorities areas in England have told us that they're delivering additional training and support into local schools and FE providers. And it's important for us as a department to work with them in terms of those discussions of how we can support them in terms of delivering that support.
Just an additional thought, though, but the new variant, I'm afraid to say, is no longer confined to London and the southeast. My own director of public health told me that within the last week or so, 55% of those people who've tested positive have the new variant, and of course, the new variant is much more transmissible. And of course, teaching staff and teaching school managers and other school support staff, are at home, parents, partners, wives, husbands, daughters, sons of people who they live in the household with. So with that new variant and the transmissibility, obviously there is extra additional worry, that if schools do become over full, that the likelihood of transmission really does magnify, and that is, it's a genuine concern expressed to me by many teachers and school managers.
Ian, as you I know that you're aware of, is that the reason that schools were closed were to take the overall approach of reducing movement across all of society, not because the chief medical officer, deputy chief medical officer are the greatest advocates for having children in school because of the amazing benefits, but we did have to make that decision in terms of reducing movement.
Sorry, I beg your pardon for interrupting, but we were told just a few days before the school closures by a survey from Public Health England, as I understand it, that actually school closures had a marginal effect on the rate of transmissions.
And where school closures, because as we've always, schools are the best place for children always to be, and they're a safe place and a safe community with the measures that are put in place. But the reason that the decision was made when we reached a COVID alert level 5, and we were seeing that incredibly strong spike in cases, was it was a measure that would reduce movement among the whole community. And it was an additional measure that we always, as you can understand as Education Secretary, it is not a step that I ever wanted to take, and would have, we were taking some quite, extensive actions to try and avoid that, including the rollout of mass testing. But the advice was that it could play a useful role in terms of actually reducing movement in community and ensuring that this national lockdown had a greater impact in terms of suppressing the virus. But Ian, in terms of, the data does bear out that actually it has had the impact of the fact that only 14% of children are in school. So it has had that immediate impact overall. But it is really important that we continue with our testing regime, because that plays, again, a really important role as one of the measures for ensuring that we tackle COVID, do everything we can do to stop it coming into school, but also helping make sure that people are aware that they have COVID wider in the community by doing that mass testing.
I think Secretary of State, though, you do need to clarify that 14% number, because I'm certainly aware that in my own locality here, many more than 14% of children have access to some school, and possibly on a rotational basis. And I would be interested to see what the actual number of children who've got some input into schools, actually attending school, even on a rotational basis, would be. It's much, much more than 14%.
Well, I mean, I'm just going on the data that we've collected from schools, Ian. So this was the data that was taken nationwide. And
I think that's a snapshot, Secretary of State, rather than an indication of how many children are actually having a physical interaction with their school.
Well, it was the data taken from all schools on the 11th of January.
It's a snapshot.
It is a snapshot, but it's a snapshot that we do every single day. And I think,
but I think, Secretary of State, it's important for parents and for the wider population to have an understanding that 14% is not the number of children who are having a physical interaction with their school, even on a rotational basis. It's much more than that.
Well, Ian, it's actually. But what you'll see is if you're having children having a experience on a rota basis, it will obviously, when you have the data across all days, you'll have a clear picture. But this is data that's based on evidence submitted by schools. But maybe if I could just bring Susan in just to comment on the data and the veracity of it.
Yeah, so this is the collection that we do daily. It was made reference to earlier that we've been doing attendance collections through last term, and that we changed the attendance collections precisely so that we could understand the picture under these new circumstances and collect information about vulnerable and critical worker children attending school. Mm-hmm. The picture is that overall 14% of the total cohort were in schools on Monday.
A particular day.
But we collect it every day.
Yeah.
And so we'll publish the data as we have been doing. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's hugely widespread use of rotas. I'm very willing to be to hear more about that from schools and so on. But in terms of the question you're raising, which is how far are we reducing movement in order to help reduce transmission, the number of people who are moving on any one day is highly relevant to that. So what we've done is we've taken 85% of the movement that's due to schools out of the I think what you may be hearing is that there's quite a different picture for primary and secondary schools. So within that 14%, attendance in primary schools averages closer to 20%, and attendance in secondary schools averages closer to 4%. And further, we also saw lots of people raising concern about individual schools where levels of attendance were very high. And again, we've looked for that very closely in the data. Actually, what we see is that the proportion of schools with more than half their children in is around 2%. There are a small number of schools out there, as the Secretary of State said. They may well be schools that are next to a hospital or near a place, for example, schools in the docks where people are handling food. We need those people to be able to do that in order to keep people fed and healthy. But it's a very small proportion of schools. And the public health advice we have is that the key driver, the reason for closing schools, was to reduce that overall amount of transmission, and that they are comfortable that an individual school may have higher levels of attendance than another. As long as the school has the same measures in place that they had last term when they had all children in, they're comfortable that that is a perfectly reasonable thing to be doing, as long as the overall numbers across the whole system have come down significantly enough to help us reduce that movement. So those numbers that suggest we've reduced that by 85%, we'll clearly be keeping a close eye on that. We're also able to look at what proportion of those who've requested a place have been given one. And again, we want to work with schools that are worried. So there's three issues, aren't there? There's transmission across the whole of the country and how schools play a role in that. There's an issue about individual school safety, which also plays. And again, just trying to make sure people are comfortable that, again, the public health advice we have is there isn't a sort of proportion limit at which you become unsafe. It's about the measures you've got in place in your school to manage the children you have in. And then the third issue is about the practical management of that. So we know that for some schools, they were expecting much lower levels of attendance, and they'd organised themselves in a way that meant that managing the children who were in school and the children for whom they do remote learning was difficult.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is working through the RSCs with schools to help them find the models and the ways of working that will help them manage sensibly and safely for all those children. So we can educate the children who do need to be in school, and the children who need to be educated remotely, and we can do that sensibly. And well, we want to really support schools in doing that. We completely understand that this is really difficult for people as well.
Thank you. Just very briefly before I pass to Tom, on the 2nd of January, the Department for Education sent out to myself and some other MPs saying that the Public Health England survey with the London School of Tropical Medicine, of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, said that school closure would only have a minor and temporary effect on transmission rates, and the wider impact of this on children's social, physical, educational and emotional development would be significant. And that was sent out to us on the 2nd of January, based on, as I understand it, looking at the new variant of COVID. What changed in a few days that schools suddenly closures would have a dramatic effect on transmission, whereas on the 2nd of January, the PHE advice was that it has a marginal effect?
Well, Robert, we're all incredibly committed to making sure that sort of schools opened, and we saw an incredibly high proportion of schools open in non-contingency framework areas on that 4th of January. But when the Prime Minister had received the advice about the change of moving to COVID alert level 5, and also the most recent data, it was a decision that felt that needed to be taken, that the place that we never wanted to be in, the situation where we, it's always been a national priority to keep schools open. For me, it's always been clear they should be the last things to close and they should be the first things to open. But it became clear as a result of that further data that was coming in, that it was a decision that would have to be taken because it would play a role in suppressing movement within the communities of which schools are, and would play a role in helping suppress the virus. But it was something that was done with no reluctance.
So because of the schools, that was only 2 days later that this evidence changed. So it's, the Permanent Secretary, I think, wants to say something, Secretary of State. Susan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. So my understanding is that the PHE evidence, though published on the 2nd of January, related to a period earlier in the autumn term before the new variant was dominant. But I think the second thing that changed was that even marginal changes in transmission started to become very salient because of the reproduction rate of the new variant, but also because of the pressure we were seeing on the NHS. So the thing that happened on the morning of the 4th of January was that shift to level 5 for the NHS, and that moment where we were clearly told the NHS was under extreme pressure. And at that point, even things that had an effect that in the past we had considered to be outweighed by the benefits to children of remaining in school, we started to be advised we really have to do everything we think could have an effect of any significance. So I think there are two things. I think first, the assessment of effect size changed a bit with new variant, but second, we moved from a place where doing something with a relatively small effect wasn't outweighed by the benefits to children remaining in education. To what people were saying, we just had to do anything that might have an effect.
Thank you. It would be good to know, and we'll question next week whether the survey was based on just purely the old variant. For sure. Tom, been waiting incredibly patiently. He's going to ask his questions plus Jonathan Gullis's.
A lot of questions.
Yeah,
Secretary of State, I couldn't agree more. It's a very challenging situation for teachers who are required to teach online, but also, in the school at the same time. Very challenging, very stressful, I can imagine. But it does seem that, last time schools closed, most schools did a brilliant job. But sadly, most of the surveys that we've seen would indicate that there have been some occasions where this wasn't the case. I think your view is that Ofsted should play a much more sort of proactive role this time in ensuring that there is good quality across the board. And I've seen some detail on this, but I'd be very grateful if you could outline sort of practically how you expect this to happen, and if there is a particular school where it seems as though they're not really stepping up, what actions would be taken. And the other question I've got is in relation to live online lessons. I have seen that there's been, I think, some of the teaching unions have expressed views on this, about how that they've got concerns about live online lessons and what this might mean for privacy. I've seen others who think that actually live online lessons are very important because there's a degree of interaction you simply don't get when it's pre-recorded. And especially, it gives young people the chance to interact with their teachers and other members of the class, etc. Just wanted to know what your views are on those two key points.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. So I think we've seen a real massive step shift in terms of the offer and what schools are providing in terms of remote education for children since March of last year. And even in March, April, May, there are many schools that really were trailblazers and led the way. And they've started to set the standard as to what we want to see in all schools. The reason that back in last year we set out our expectations of what remote education would look like was because we did recognise the fact that there was a very real possibility that schools could be closed again. And I know that that was a controversial thing to do that did meet with some opposition, but I firmly believe it was a right thing to set out clearly what standards were expected. And all schools and FE providers are expected to publish information about their remote education provision on their websites by the 25th of January for schools and the 18th of January for FE providers. As I say, I think we've seen a seismic shift in terms of what is being delivered. And it's a real tribute to the teaching profession, the whole school community who've really embraced this and actually doing wonderful things. And then you have the additional support of the Oak National Academy, which we've invested in heavily. And if there are issues in a school or a parent has, we would always ask that parent to have that conversation with a teacher to sort of try and resolve it and to sort that out. If that isn't resolved, we then ask them to have that conversation with the head teacher in order to be able to resolve it and sort it out. But there is a duty on us to ensure standards in education, and a little bit like what we expect in terms of children in a physical classroom. If the education isn't being provided to the standards that would be expected, then we have to accept the fact that there has to be some form of recourse, and the ultimate last form of recourse would always be Ofsted, and that would be the same in this one. But we would, that is, certainly not something that we, firstly, people shouldn't be going to as a first stop, and it should only be very much a last course of action. In terms of live online lessons, and this is where the development of remote education has moved so rapidly, I think that live online lessons can be an important part of the whole package of what teachers and schools are able to offer. And it's certainly something that sort of, we'd encourage them to sort of see as part of that whole package of what they can deliver children.
Sorry, a final couple of questions. DFE guidance indicates that children without access to remote learning can be treated as vulnerable and attend school during the lockdown. is this provision being adhered to by schools and head teachers? What impact is it having on the numbers attending school and on teachers? And finally, a question about teacher recruitment and retention. This was a big issue before the pandemic, but obviously I just wanted to know what your thoughts are about how you think this pandemic may have impacted or may impact the government strategy for teacher recruitment and retention going forward. There may be some aspects actually which is quite helpful, because the role of a teacher is being at the forefront and the heroic way in which many of them have carried out their business. But on the other hand, the amount of stress that many teachers have been put under, I guess the concern is that some may leave a profession and some might be put off going into it.
Yeah. Sorry. So in terms of the allocation of vulnerable, sort of those children don't have access to laptops, the data would indicate that, as I say, an overall 14% of pupils in attendance, and doesn't seem to have indicated that there has been an abnormal impact on it. We do leave schools and leadership of schools to make a judgment, and obviously, where there are families as are in that difficult situation, we would really very much hope that teachers, the schools would able to work with that family to help support them. In terms of teacher recruitment, it looks as if the teaching profession, what people have seen sort of firsthand about the amazing job that teachers are doing right across the country, the important role and the important impact that they're having on children's lives. What it is actually showing is it's really driving teacher recruitment numbers, and we're seeing a large increase in the number of people who are wanting to come into the teaching profession. This is, really positive signs in terms of substantial increases in the number of children, number of people who are leaving university, doing PGCEs, taking on the initial teacher training, really driving numbers up. We still recognise we face challenges within some of the most difficult recruitment areas, but we still have a strong package to really highlight what a brilliant career teaching is. But the numbers are incredibly positive, and we are. I'm confident that
Secretary of State, we've got loads to get through, and I just
Secretary of State,
please, if you just do it in a nutshell as much as possible, it would be great. Okay, Tom, have you finished?
That's me done. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to please ask Jonathan Gullis's questions? Some of them.
So one of the questions was about this potential additional pressure on school budgets. Many schools, certainly a number in my constituency, have really gone above and beyond when it comes to making sure that when they were open, the environment was safe and secure. It was regularly cleaned. There was adequate measures in place to make sure everyone was safe, both pupils and teachers. This has meant it's an additional cost to them, and I just wanted to know that in future whether this would be taken into account.
Well, you saw in terms of the first, saw in terms of the first national lockdown where schools were closed. We put a package of measures there in order to support schools during that period. Over 14,000 claims were lodged with the department, 14,075, and so far 13,000 schools have received payments, in terms of reimbursement, and obviously working through the final ones of those. We also put a package of support for the winter, sort of going up to Christmas, and we'll be looking at actually what additional help and support is required for schools. We are very much recognising that they are actually having quite acute pressures. We understood that when we were rolling out the testing regime, and recognised there needs to be a financial package put in place there to support schools when they're fully rolling that out. and there will no doubt be pressures on school budgets as a result of some of the things they're having to do. We've made it very clear in terms of preschool meals, if there's locally derived vouchers, we're covering the cost of that. We're putting extra payments in terms of school food if they're delivering those food parcels locally within the school. That's why we're putting the national food voucher scheme will be online from next week for schools to be able to use. But we do recognise as we go through the coming weeks, there'll probably be further measures and further support that will be required.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State.
Thanks. I just want to read a question from Jonathan Gullis, whose internet connection is not working. Will the Secretary of State understand the frustration felt by both teachers and parents over who can and cannot be in school at present? Many schools are rightly using health and risk assessments from lockdown 1 and therefore limiting sizes of pupils in classrooms, yet who is eligible to access school is broader and vague. This is causing conflict between parents and school leaders unfairly. So what can be done to resolve this? Schools in Stoke and Kidsgrove in his constituency are telling him that due to those student numbers coming in, they might as well be open to all pupils as all staff are having to still come in. Could you comment on that, please, Secretary of State?
Of course. Well, firstly, the guidance that we have in terms of critical workers has been very consistent from the initial guidance that we issued back in March of last year. There have been some small changes. I think the eligibility of number of workforce that potentially have come into scope is 11,000 nationally, but it has been largely static from where it was before. We are starting, as I say, we're getting the first cut of data, both at a national level, at a regional, local authority level, and also at a school level. And what I've asked regional schools commissioners to do is to target those real hotspots where there are challenges and actually how we can work to support schools. Firstly, to put them in the best position to be able to make the full provision that's needed for those children who need to be in school, but also to work with local, those local schools, but also local authorities if there's particular concerns around the impact and deliverability on that. And we're very confident that we can work through some of these issues. We think it's a small number. The initial cut of data indicates there's actually quite a small number of schools that will be facing that challenge, but we don't underestimate the challenge that those schools are facing and how we work with them, support them in order to deliver the places for critical workers that need them, but at the same time making sure that this is done in a way that's sustainable for the school.
Thank you. Can I please bring in Kim, who's waited a long time? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. I've got some questions in this section on connectivity and laptops. So it's estimated that over 1.7 million children suffer from digital poverty. So what estimates do you have of the number of disadvantaged and vulnerable children who still remain without a device or internet access? And will the government consider rolling out free Wi-Fi access to all families in receipt of universal credit so no child is left behind? Thank you.
Well, Kim, it's so incredibly important that the actions that we take in terms of devices and access to, access to the internet. That's why at the start of the pandemic, we made the bold decision to actually start investing in digital devices. By the end of this week, we will see a total rollout of 750,000 devices to schools across the country. In terms of looking at the numbers that were required, Kim, what we had done is we used the latest data that we had in terms of the amount of laptops and tablets that are available in the sector. That's about 2.9 million devices that already sit within the sector. We've made a commitment to procure on top of that 2.9 million devices, that additional 1.3 million devices. The rollout is going very well. We believe that actually with such a such a range of devices within the sector, it puts schools in the best possible position to be able to support children that maybe don't have ownership of their own device or access to one in their own home. Again, you make a really important point about internet access. We had trialled during the first stage of the pandemic a number of approaches working with BT and other providers. What we found was the most beneficial to most families was working with mobile access data partners in order to be able to increase the limits. This has had a real big impact on for many young people. And, I'd always like to take the opportunity to thank EE3, Tesco Mobile, Smarty, Sky Mobile, Virgin Mobile, O2, Vodafone, BT for what they're doing.
Okay.
Also the measures to no rate.
Okay, got it. We've got to get the next question, Kim, please. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate that so many devices have been sent out and issued, Secretary of State, but members on this committee are still hearing from schools within our constituencies that are still received access to resources. So it would be useful if you could let us know what DFE information is available and whether you could share that with this committee, please, Secretary of State.
So Kim, by the end of this week, all schools will have received their full estimated allocation of devices. But we do recognise there'll be some schools that are in a position that maybe haven't got the number of devices in schools that they would have procured over a period of time. And that's why we've continued to invest in devices over and above that estimated level that they'd need, so that schools are able to come to the Department for Education where they do have specific needs. We've had over 400 schools make requests on this basis, which we've looked. And of course, we're very happy to share with the committee the working that we did in terms of the initial estimates of the procurements that we made and how actually we're best in the best position to support digital devices.
Thank you, Kim.
Also, Secretary of State, we've heard that those laptops that have been issued to schools have to be wiped by teachers because they don't have the necessary monitoring systems in place so that children can't access inappropriate sites. And so the schools have had to install their own systems. Can this be reviewed and fed back to the committee as well, please?
Kim, if you wouldn't mind, do you mind if I just bring in Susan on this one, who I think is wanting to come in and speak to it?
Okay.
Thanks very much indeed. So we know that lots of schools already have in place different systems that they use. And so the basis we've done this on is first that schools can select the type of device they want so that it fits with what they're already using in school. And second, they can manage how they set the device up so it fits, as I say, with existing devices they might have in school, so it can be part of their system. But I'm very happy to look and see whether there is more we can do within the department that would be sensibly done across all schools and wouldn't effectively just mean they had something on but they wanted to take it off and put their own thing on because it fitted with what they were doing in school already. So we're really happy.
I think that would be useful, thanks, Susan, in terms of safeguarding children. That'd be great if you could let us know. That'd be great. So
use their own different things, and so we're trying to be flexible to what they're doing already.
I think, Kim, one of the challenges is obviously you have 22,000 schools, often with very different systems.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to second guess which is the best system for every one of those schools is going to be incredibly challenging. And by imposing a system on all of them, it may reduce their operability between the current devices that they have. But we're very happy to look at that as if there's any things that we can do more that can help support schools.
Yeah, I understand the logistical issues relating to that, right? It's just about making sure that children are safeguarded. My last question in this section, will the government consider establishing a new dedicated technology budget for schools to help them tackle the digital divide in communities going forward? Because if this is going to be the new normal going forward and there's more online learning. So yes, thank you.
Kim, I sort of feel as if you're almost trying to get me to sort of engage in a debate with Treasury via yourself. But I'm going to sort of probably sort of duck that a little bit, if you don't mind. But what we, all the actions that we've taken in terms of this mass rollout of devices really shows that how, we see devices as an important part, not just in terms of supporting children's learning while we're in a national lockdown and where schools can't be open to all children, but they will play an incredibly important role in terms of supporting children catching up, not just within school, but outside of school time as well.
Thanks, Secretary of State. Something worth considering for the future then. Thank you. Thanks, Rob. All my questions.
Thank you, Kim. Just to ask you, is there, because you still get a lot of schools who say they haven't got their allocation for one reason or another, or they're missing 10 or 15. Is there a dedicated helpline that they can call and that is genuinely answered? Because the schools say to me they try and get hold of the DFE and they can't get the allocation that they need. What is the situation?
So obviously, the allocation of is actually done, if it's a maintained school, it's done through the local authority. If it is part of a multi-academy trust, it is done through the multi-academy trust. There is a dedicated email that schools are able to go to. And so if, for example, if a school has a query, that would be immediately come back to, but the whole allocation for all schools will be cleared.
And if there is a problem, why not just give the school vouchers so they can go and buy Chromebooks at their local Currys? So if they're missing 17 computers, as one school told me, but why not just make it very simple and just say, right, here's some vouchers, you can go down to Argos or Currys?
Well, obviously, we've been doing one of the largest laptop procurement exercises in the world at the moment. So we've obviously been bringing in supply, but there is the supply that has sort of come into the country in terms of being able to satisfy that. So we weren't moving to a voucher scheme at present because all the information that we have is that we should be able to deliver the full allocations by the end of this week. There may be sometimes issues with local authorities passing those devices through to the school, but if that is a problem, we do have the ability to look at that, have those conversations with that local authority, okay, the Academy Trust.
Okay, and just to confirm, either you or from the Permanent Secretary, what is the updated figure of those children who don't have access to computers at home at the moment?
Susan, I wonder if you can come in on this.
Even after your laptop scheme, what's the updated figure that you know of children who don't have access to laptops or tablets or at home?
Well, I mean, if you look at the total numbers of devices that are available to the school system, by the time the full rollout of the digital devices program is out there, there'll be an estimated 4.2 million laptops and sort of iPads or iPads equivalent within the school system, which is substantially higher than all the estimates that people sort of put in terms of where there are challenges that people have with digital devices. So but we do recognise that, you know, as part.
Can you possibly just send us the updated figure if you don't have it with you, unless the permanent secretary has it? I don't know.
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Okay, if you could just send us, because that I think would be quite helpful.
We don't collect data from families on whether or not their children have private laptops at home, I'm afraid.
What I'm going to do, Flo, is take yours and Ian's question together so they can both answer at once, because we're behind time. So Ian, if you could go first, and then I'll bring in Flo, and then I'll ask the Secretary of State to answer them together. Ian.
Yes, thank you very much. Secretary of State, you know, I've heard what's been said about the distribution of devices and how many have gone out and how many more are ordered, but there are still schools with nil, you know, and you know, when you've got schools with nil who have got 40% of pupils on free school meals or 50% of pupils on free school meals, there's something wrong with the system there. So, you know, how can they have nil in terms of devices provided by the DFE, even via the local authority? I just don't understand that.
Well, Ian, that certainly shouldn't be.
Was I going to come?
Oh, sorry, Flynn.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry, Secretary of State. Just to add to that about data provision. So it's all very well having a laptop, but for many of the most economically and educationally disadvantaged families, they're on pay-as-you-go records. They're on GIFGAF, Leica and Labara, who you don't have agreements with, and they don't have data. 40,000 data routers have been distributed, but there's a big digital gap there as well. So is that a problem that you recognise, and what can you do to support for more data routers to be distributed as well alongside the laptops? Thank you.
So if I could pick up Ian's point, I mean, you know, all the data shows that in terms of the allocation of devices that, you know, that's proceeding very much at the pace and at that we're sort of been, you know, continue to ramp up to. What I'd ask is, Ian, is maybe if you wouldn't mind sending through particular schools where you've got an issue with, because obviously we'll have the data in terms of where it's going out. If there's an issue, we'd rather sort of look at that as against me giving you not a fully informed answer. Fleur, I actually think the routers are a really important part of the answer to that, because as you rightly say, it's great when you have the likes of EE, Vodafone, so many of us coming in, but the routers are an important part and in terms of actually having that sort of data capacity. And you know, we've delivered 54,000 5G wireless routers and continue to provide this, and we continue to look at how we can sort of upscale that, because there's not been as high a demand for them among schools as we were probably initially expecting when we initially rolled out the programme, but I think that demand is going to increase over the coming weeks, and we'll look at scaling up the capacity of what we can deliver.
Thank you. Kim now has a question on the catch-up fund. Kim.
Thanks again, Rob and Secretary of State. Many disadvantaged children have experienced significant learning loss, as we know, widening the education gap, particularly Black kids. And Nick Gibb, in his letter to the Women and Equalities Committee, claimed there is emerging evidence of a potential for greater impact on these children, and for schools and colleges to consider the diverse needs of the cohort when providing support. So can you let us know further funding beyond the 1 billion that's already been announced to prevent children from disadvantaged backgrounds falling further behind? And what have you learned so far from the money that has been spent, and what impact has it made? And as you know, that not all learning will be online, and as a result of 10 years of austerity, community centres and libraries have closed, denying disadvantaged kids reliable, safe and free access to technology and reading materials. And will the government invest in our communities to support children to access learning outside of school, which is also very important? Thanks, Secretary of State.
Well, thank
you.
See
if you can do that, summarise that, if you can, in your answer.
It was broad and extensive, Mr. And I thought Kim was going to sort of pay tribute to the record funding settlements that the government has announced for schools over the last couple of years, but maybe she got cut short, Mr. Chairman. We're looking very closely at the real benefits and the delivery of the COVID catch-up fund. All the evidence points to making an enormous impact to schools, so many schools, not just for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but children from all backgrounds, giving extra lessons, extended learning in the day, extended learning even on weekends and in holiday periods, giving booster sessions, and of course the National Tutoring Programme, which again is seeing an incredibly successful rollout, and we're able to ensure that it was to span across 2 years, which is really important for putting in roots. This additional national lockdown is creating additional pressures on especially those who are most disadvantaged. We want to take the evidence of what works best and actually provide those evidence-based solutions to really continue to drive the change and support that those children need from the most disadvantaged communities. And that's what will inform our actions about what we do additional to the already extensive £1 billion programme we've outlined.
So just very briefly, the National Tutoring Programme has suggested that the catch-up sessions may be postponed because of the lockdown, and just 22 of the 33 providers are on the list of that can deliver tutoring online to pupils in their homes. So just to understand, given the need that you've set out to help disadvantaged pupils recover lost learning, I'm concerned that the part of the programme may be put on ice, and also why have a third of registered providers not yet been approved to deliver that online education at home, and what can you do to make sure that more can?
So we're very rapidly moving to ensure all of them will be able to deliver online. And what we're doing is we're giving schools the option as to whether they want to pause it or continue it. My hope is that most schools, and I think it's best to leave that to the local decision of the headmaster, who will know the local circumstances best. But my hope is that the overwhelming majority will continue to pursue it and continue to see that rollout, which has already seen such a successful uptake.
Thank you. Apsana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. Teachers and support staff across the country are using from their own budgets, sometimes their own income, to cover costs linked to managing schools for the children of key workers and those still attending, for things like cleaning, and there's expected to be extra cost linked to work associated with teacher assessments. Is the government making further additional funds available for schools in light of these extra costs caused by the latest lockdown? If I could just refer to an answer sort of made earlier, we've at all stages through this is looked at what additional financial support would be needed in terms of the tasks that we're asking teachers to do in terms of teacher assessment for grading. We're obviously looking at how we put the resources and training around that to support teachers in doing that. But in terms of the issues to do with running a school in this national lockdown, we'll obviously look at what steps we can take to support schools in terms of making sure they're not out of pocket. Last week in your speech to the House, you promised that the National Voucher Scheme would be relaunched. Coincidentally, as we're now in this session of the committee, there's been an announcement that the National Voucher Scheme is back on Monday. That's 2 weeks since schools closed to most children. Children are going hungry. Given all the errors and challenges of the scheme in the first lockdown, what has been taking so long this time?
So no children should be going hungry. And what we said, and you'll probably recall in the statement, we said that schools would be, we asked them to provide either food parcels or,
locally procured vouchers, of which the cost would be covered by the department. Eden Red have set up the system that is going to be ready to be activated for all schools from Monday of next week. That was always a lot of schools in the first lockdown said that they wanted to do their own local provision, and we didn't want to be overriding them in terms of that. But we believe that actually that national voucher scheme is really important. It's ready to roll. Schools will be able to order it. Any costs that schools have incurred by procuring vouchers themselves locally are going to be covered by the Department for Education. So we're wanting to give schools the maximum amount of choice in terms of what they think is right for their pupils.
Thank you. Absana?
So it's Eden Red again, and what assurances can you give that errors and challenges experienced in that system in the first lockdown won't be repeated? And can you sort of guarantee that families eligible for free school meals will have access to the voucher system as long as there are at least some children out of school because of the coronavirus crisis?
Well, obviously, it's a choice for the school to make as to whether they do. Whether they do a local solution or whether they use the national voucher, food voucher scheme. So it is actually the choice of the school in order to be able to do that. We've also made it absolutely clear, and you'll probably remember from the contingency framework when you probably looked at it back in October time, one of the things that you said is while schools are in a situation where they are in lockdown, free not fully open, free school meals will be provided, and in terms of the system, if we think back to March, April last year, we effectively set up an enormous, sort of a substantial welfare scheme. It's incredibly in incredible speed in order to deal with the challenges of free school meals. Obviously, there were, real challenges in doing that, and we've learned a lot from that. But if I can bring the permanent secretary in, who would just maybe like to...
Yeah, very briefly, if you can. Thank you, because we've still got a fair bit.
Super quick. You asked what we were doing to make sure that we'd learned lessons from the last experience with Eden Red. We've been working with them very closely, but we've also used the last few days to make sure that we've looked again at the negotiations we had with them on the terms, but also the management information and the standards we're setting around the contract. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't turn it on day one. We wanted to make sure we'd done the tightening and then turned it on.
Thank you. Can I ask, who was consulted over the new guidance for free school meals?
How do you mean who was consulted?
So the new guidance, I'll just pick out one part of the new guidance. Cool. So you might not be aware of this, but the new guidance states that they strongly encourage schools to provide food parcels to pupils at home. But at the same time, the guidance suggests that schools can only be able to claim up to £3.50 in additional funding for food parcels compared to £15 for vouchers. So that's both things in the guidance for free school meals. It's very confusing.
So, Absana, what we do is we top up the level of funding. So if you take an example of Reach Academy in London, they've done, all the way through the last lockdown, they did an amazing job of actually supporting children on free school meals by using their kitchens to be able to produce highly nutritious, really fantastic meals. For students that were incredibly, great nutrition content and everything else. So we wanted to be able to expand the amount of money that they would able to have to do that. But equally, if the route that schools wanted to take was to do the locally procured vouchers, we wanted to give them the clear guidance that it will be up to £15. And equally, if they wanted to use the national voucher scheme, which is something that a lot of schools got used to using and got used to the ordering process, we wanted to make sure that that whole suite of options was available to them. And we felt that by giving them a maximum amount of options for them to choose from was the best way of doing it.
Can I just ask, in terms of food parcels themselves, what kind of standards or official school food standards are they required to meet? And, what kind of steps are you taking to enforce those standards?
Well, we're very clear in terms of the actual, what we expect. It's a variety of different types of fruits and vegetables. It's about the importance of protein foods, the importance of dairy and dairy alternatives, making sure, and, the guidance is really, really clear. And there's no, we should not tolerate, and we will stand absolute square behind schools and supporting schools where providers aren't delivering what is required. It is just not simply acceptable. And
how do you do that? Sorry, Secretary of State. That's I understand the commitment, but what's the way in which you enforce the standards?
Well, ultimately, those the standards are there. Every contractor that has a contract with a school, a local authority, a multi-academy trust should be meeting those standards. That's absolutely essential part of what they're meant to be delivering. And if they're not meeting those standards, then ultimately those contracts can and will be cancelled by the school, by the local authority, by the multi-academy trust, if they're not delivering what they're meant to be delivering for that school and, most importantly, for those children.
Okay. Are you aware that the process of food distribution is placing enormous pressure on schools themselves, being asked to, sort of pull together very quickly with lots of challenges, particularly in rural areas?
So we are, and that's why we put a whole variety of different mechanisms in place. So it was either food parcels to support pupils or meals going directly to pupils. It was whether it was locally procured vouchers, because you mentioned in rural areas, the distances might mean that there's only a certain supermarket that people are able to go to, would maybe not be included on the national voucher scheme. So it's important to give them the flexibility to do that. And then also standing up the national voucher scheme. But one of the reasons, as I'm asking, I've got all the major, all the caterers and the food distribution companies that support schools, meeting them this afternoon, is hammering home the clear message that they have got to be meeting our national food standards in terms of what they're delivering, and there will ultimately be consequences to the not meeting those.
Okay, I mean, you may not be aware of this, but there is an increased stigma for many families and sort of unnecessary stress and distress caused for pupils and parents with food parcels distributions. Now, the National Education Union are calling for a sensible, safe and sort of non-stigmatizing system to be put in place until, whatever normal is, sort of normal school attendance resumes. Is that something your department is or will explore? And I was just sort of thinking about the fact that, building the infrastructure needed for free school meals could be crucial for pandemic recovery. So for the long term, is your department willing to explore bringing the delivery of free school meals by involving all of the community in food provision, looking at unionized jobs, utilizing community infrastructure to ensure high quality food? In other words, a public free school meals program over and above the, the outsourcing to companies which cannot guarantee standards?
Well, so firstly, it's really to pay tribute to so many people who are working in school kitchens up and down the country, producing brilliant school meals to so many. And we mustn't forget the brilliant quality that is being done for so very many. And our thanks to all those staff who are delivering on that. This is why we've taken, a really broad and flexible approach with schools in order to be able to give them as much choice about how best to deliver. And as I say, that might be a locally procured scheme, it might be the national voucher scheme, it might be delivery direct from their kitchen.
We're going to have to move on because we are running out of time. Sana, just one more question.
I've got a few questions if I can, especially on the cancellation of exams, Chair. It's really important we try.
Okay,
I'll try to be as quick as possible.
If you could ask them together, that would be great. Okay,
I'll ask them together. I take the answer to the last question was actually a no, Secretary of State. But moving on to the cancellation of exams, in a letter from you to the Select Committee, you stated that you wish to thank Ofqual for the collaborative work over recent months to prepare for all potential scenarios in relation to the exams this year. Can I ask, firstly, why did it reach us at 9:15 this morning?
What we wanted to do is to be able to share the information in terms of what we're doing with Ofqual. What I said in the House of Commons last week is these grades are going to be based on teacher judgment. It is teachers who know the pupils best, and we wanted to be able to share with you as much information as possible of how that's going to be structured.
Okay. Thank you. Sana, can you ask your questions together if possible, please?
Of course, letter to you, again, received by the committee this morning, mentioned lessons learnt from last summer. Can you outline what lessons they are that the department and yourself have learnt from last summer? And given all the education unions and the National Governance Association wrote to yourself in October with detailed suggestions for exams, and including sort of a plan B for exams if exams couldn't go ahead, we assumed that the contingency plans were well developed. Where are they? What do you think the exams should or the assessment situation should look like going forward? I appreciate that there is a consultation that is sort of going to be launched, I think, next week for 2 weeks. Can you provide specific timelines as to the consultation and the outcome of the consultation, and when you expect to have a plan of action in place for this year?
Well, as you can imagine, the work on terms of contingency plans has been a very long body of work where we've had to sort of work very closely in terms of listening to the sector as to some of the challenges that moving away from exams will present. We, as outlined in my letter to Ofqual, we set out quite clearly how this is going to be teacher judgment in terms of the awarding of grades, how we create the structure and support for teachers. And one of the things that was very clear from teachers is that they wanted it to be clearly outlined for the structures that would be there to support them in arriving at the right and appropriate grade for pupils, so they can explain to both pupils and to parents as to when that's done. But these are important measures. The consultation is being undertaken from the start of this week. It will run for 2 weeks, and the information obviously will be shared very, very rapidly. But we set out very clearly as to how teacher grading is going to be done.
And just one more question, if I may. In terms of teacher assessed grades being moderated, I mean, are you in favour of that moderation? And if so, who do you think should be involved in that? And how do you think an appeals system should work, given the concerns that many students, particularly of BAME backgrounds, feel concerned about sort of outcomes and sort of fairness?
Well, quite simply, teacher judgment is what we're relying on. We're obviously putting in terms of working with the sector to make sure that there's proper and fair sort of checks and balances. But it's teacher judgment that is what we're relying on, and it's important that it's absolutely vital and clear there's any changes to grades as a result of any external quality assurance process should be an absolute exception, because it's teacher judgments that we're relying on, not algorithms. But you are right to point out there needs to be a very strong and robust appeals process, and that's also what we've asked Ofqual to put in place in order to be able to back up this process.
Can I just conclude, Chair, with just one more question? Will you apologise to the National Education Union and school leaders for not heeding to their advice on safety and closure of schools, and for the repeated last-minute communications given to them, causing undue stress and pressure on their resources and their mental health?
We always want to be in a situation of having pupils in school. People who work in schools want to be welcoming children into the classroom, because they realise that actually that's the best way of imparting their knowledge, imparting their enthusiasm, imparting their passion for the subjects they teach to the children. So being passionate about having children in schools, I think, is absolutely a vital part of being Education Secretary. And I will continue to work with head teachers, all those who work in the education sectors and unions to ensure that all children are welcomed back into schools at the earliest possible moment. We all want to see schools open and with children having the benefit of being in the classroom, being with their teacher,
learning. Got it. Thank you. Caroline, if you could just do a brief one, but could you also ask about private candidates as well, please?
Yeah, so I had two relatively quick, not essentially related questions, but two quick questions. First question, Secretary of State, is, I'll ask them together, is when you have teachers training, new teachers training at the moment, have you added anything into the teacher training regards to teaching people online, particularly in relation to the younger children where that is especially challenging, so that our newest teachers qualifying this year will have those skills in case they're necessary? And the second question is, I know we've talked about this, the difficulty of finding an algorithm to replace exams was a challenge last year that hasn't gone away with cancelling exams. And it seems to me that you have problems with motivation and emotional well-being from cancelling exams and how to keep students going. And many students that are keen to show what they know. And I was wondering what you thought of the concept of a narrative verdict, because employers want to know how much knowledge a student's gained, how much knowledge the student might have gained in the teacher's view if they had been able to be in school, and how much of education has been disrupted if there is a difference between those two figures. What would be your view of asking students, if they wish to sit exams, to allow them to do that, because we're expecting a much more favourable environment in terms of restrictions by the summer, and then providing students with a certificate that gives those three pieces of information, which allows a completely fair assessment of students' abilities and also the difficulties students may or may not have faced during this period.
And could you just also just explain what's going to happen to private candidates at home who don't have go to school and need to do their exams? Yeah.
So we've been absolutely clear that there has to be a very accessible route for all private candidates to be assessed and to receive a grade. And so the consultation is going to seek views on the options to do so and set out what those options are. We're very confident that this is something that can be delivered, and we do not want private candidates to feel as if they're in a position of missing out, and they are going to be in a position where they'll be receiving an awarded grade along with all other pupils within the school system. Caroline mentions a really important point about keeping motivation up. And one of the great advantages of having exams at the end of the year is a key focus point for the children to be aiming towards and working towards and keeping their attention. This is why we're asking for the teachers to make the final assessment of the grading at the tail end of the academic year, in order to be able to keep those motivational levels up, because it's really important that children are in a position to be able to continue their learning and maximising the amount that they do learn while they are in school. So it's a real strong focus in terms of doing that.
Thank you, Secretary of State. But the two questions which you didn't answer were, one, has online teaching skills been added to the training curriculum for teacher training? And the second one was the concept of a narrative verdict that gives an explanation alongside grades for students. Thank you.
So in terms of the narrative verdict, this isn't something that we're looking at doing currently, because but we're very happy. We'll always look at different options, but at the moment that isn't part of our consideration. In terms of changing the initial teacher training framework, that isn't currently also an option that we're looking at doing. But we do recognise that teachers who have newly qualified are entering a very different teaching environment than any of them would have expected. This is why we continued with the rollout of the early career framework. And we're looking at how we can put extra levels of support to support those newly qualified teachers as part of that early career framework, and how we can, because obviously the experience of online teaching is quite substantially different.
Susan, if you can do it in a sentence or so, thank you.
One sentence, not in ITT, but we have delivered a one-stop shop for schools with support on remote education, including good practice guides and school-led webinars to support effective curriculum delivery. and that's on the Get Help with Remote Education pages. So, and that's available to all teachers, and there's sections for teachers, for middle leaders and for school leaders.
Thank you. Christian, and then Fleur.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, moving on to vocational and technical exams, the Association of Colleges wanted the DfE to be much more definitive as to whether vocational and technical exams should be continuing at this time, considering that all other exams have been cancelled. So how will exam boards deal with the situation where some students have continued sitting exams, such as those doing BTECs currently, feeling quite unsettled in doing so, while others will not have had any opportunity to take them at all?
Well, we face quite a sort of substantial challenge, because obviously with a lot of technical and vocational qualifications, there's almost a license to practice that many youngsters and people of all ages often have to have. And if they're not able to sort of gain and demonstrate that competency level in the area that they're working in, it can often create a barrier for them to be able to enter the place of work. So we'd taken the decision in terms of technical and vocational qualifications, it was best to have a sort of permissive approach where we were able to let colleges make those decisions, as they are the ones who would know their students best. And we saw about 1/3 of colleges using that flexibility in order to be able to proceed on that. What is absolutely clear, and you probably have seen from the letter that an exchange with Offroad, the importance of making sure that there's parity in terms of approach with general qualifications and vocational and technical qualifications is really at the heart of what we're doing. And it's so incredibly important that, that there is that parity, but recognizing that there are some particular needs that technical and vocational qualifications will need to have included in terms of actually making sure that some of the assessments are obviously to prove a professional competency, and that will need to be preserved in order for people to be able to continue to access key areas of employment.
So just to understand, they're going to, if the colleges are happy, they carry on doing their exams in January, but you're saying it's not going to happen in February and March, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Right, and so why is it okay to do it in January but not February and March?
Because, Robert, as you'll be aware, there's a whole stage of assessments, and a lot of technical and vocational qualifications have a competency assessment in terms of various different aspects. So if you take accountancy, for example, you still need to be able to demonstrate certain competency element, and the same in electrical work, gas and plumbing, in order to be able to have the ability to practice. So it's really important that, we weren't in a position where we were ruling out so many youngsters from being able to maybe move on to the next stage of their career and potentially into work by having a unilateral approach. So youngsters who will still have to show that technical competency and that sort of license to practice, they will still need to do that in order to be able to access some of those careers. But in terms of a broad assessment, we, going forward, we'll be having that sort of same approach across technical and vocational qualifications in terms of the assessments that's done. And as you're very aware, is that's much easier, sort of a much more standard practice in technical and vocational qualifications in terms of that continuous assessment done by teachers and lecturers.
So did the Permanent Secretary want to add to that?
Just very briefly, it was also, so we did also have BTECs going ahead in January, which are applied general, of course. And the reason for that was that we got quite strong views, not all pointing in the same direction from the sector themselves. Some saying the children are ready to sit these exams and we want to enable them to do that, and others saying they thought they should be cancelled. And so the permissive approach effectively allowed the people who wanted children to be able to sit to go ahead. and others not. I think it's different when you look forward to February and March, where you've got the ability to plan and you don't have the same situation of children literally being on the point of taking a qualification as the decision was taken.
Right, thank you. I'm going to Fleur, who has magnificently waited for a very long time. She's got a series of questions, and I'll probably have one or two at the end, and then we'll close, hopefully by 12:20, 25, with any luck. Fleur.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. Just in coming back on the contingency planning and the fact that you're having consultations now, as soon as the decision not to have exams was taken, then it went into consultation mode and on private students and others. Why were these consultations not held last summer when it was clearly obvious that this might have been a possibility that we'd have to not have exams, and then shared as possible contingencies with teachers, so that instead of all last term teachers having to think that they might have to do some kind of teacher assessment and planning for that, but not knowing what it would be, so it's not the same, and then finding out at the last minute now they have to do it. And just to follow up from that and maybe connected, is that 92% of teachers in a recent poll have said that they have lost faith in your leadership, and I would just like to ask what your reflection on that is and how you can regain their trust.
So thank you, Fleur. So in terms of as the chief regulator was sort of setting out, is we've been working very closely with the sector in terms of a whole set of contingency measures that would need to be put in place in relation to if we found ourselves in a situation we couldn't proceed with exams as we'd hoped to. But those contingency measures would be different depending on the point of time at where we would maybe have to deploy them. Some of those contingency measures may have had to have been about changing the way we conducted, had to take into account of how we conducted exams, that we could continue to go ahead with exams, but they'd have to be done in a different format or slimmed down. The different sort of, depending on when we'd have to move the contingency measures, meant that it would dictate as to what they looked like and actually what shape it would be in. And we weren't going to ever be in a position, last year to truly know on anyone else.
Thank you. Fleur.
One on early years and then one on universities. So on early years sector, could you, at the moment, the funding is now going to be switched to being funded based on attendance now, which is obviously down because of lockdown, instead of attendance a year ago. Could you re-look at that decision, because the costs are the same for the nurseries and it will spell financial ruin for many nurseries. And on state-maintained nurseries, they do not have parity at the moment with our other schools. So they don't have access to the catch-up COVID funding, and they are not being given the same testing and vaccination, and they are also under extreme financial pressure. Could you confirm that you would look again at the parity of the state-maintained nursery schools, and have they been left out by on purpose or by mistake?
So we announced the spring funding position before Christmas, at a time where attendance levels were getting back to
before the lockdown. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
obviously, attendance has been dramatically, lower this week and much lower than anticipated before Christmas. And this is going to cause quite substantial challenges for the early years sector and for local authorities. And we're going to look at the attendance data. We're wanting to move forward with the census, because obviously that provides important and useful information and data for departments. But we are going to have a different, going to be looking at different approaches of how we can support the early years sector, and a different approach as to how we would have been doing it in more normal circumstances that we had anticipated to be in before Christmas. In terms of how we actually support early years, this is the reason that we wanted to keep early years open, because we know the impact that it has on those young lives, how important it is for their educational development and their social development. That's why we took the decision to keep them open, because it's so important for them. And we'll continue to look at different measures of how we can support the sector. And that's what we're going to be doing and sharing those thoughts with the sector over the coming weeks.
They are feeling unsafe and unfunded at the moment, so a relook at that census, this number and the safety procedures would be very welcome. Will you also be considering putting youth services into the COVID catch-up fund? It's a whole sector next to and very important for COVID catch-up, but they haven't been included in that catch-up fund, but are essential. Would you consider that, or a special youth services fund, as they say that they're running on empty?
I'm afraid that's not something that we're looking at. We put very much our focus within the schools sector. Youth services does actually fall outside of the department and falls within DCMS. But one of the things that we will be looking at as we cast our eye towards the summer is how we can work with different providers in terms of providing additional catch-up over the summer. And that's maybe something that sector could look at how it can support educational provision, because education provision is so important, but it's also about mind and body as well. And that can be, we're seeing with a national rollout of the holiday activity programme, how important other activities are as part of that.
They would say they're the experts in providing catch-up for years, so that would be very welcome as well. Finally, on universities, many of the newer universities especially do not have financial reserves and are now struggling financially, and there is a concern that it's the survival of the fittest in terms of the university sector. There's also a problem for students. I've got two sitting in my house now who can't go back to university but are paying high accommodation costs. What will you be doing for the students, but also for the financial security of our university and academic sector?
So we'll always be, we saw action undertaken in terms of supporting universities, so how they can give that additional support for students before Christmas. We're obviously reviewing that currently, as the Prime Minister mentioned the other day. You're right to highlight that there are some institutions of all ages that are potentially in a place where they may find themselves in financial difficulty. This is why we set up a restructuring regime if universities are in a position where they're facing financial challenges, so that we actually have a program in place to support those universities if they're facing some real challenges. That's already been established. It stands ready to go. We've been in a very fortunate position that, despite some of the concerns that people had about collapse within the university sector, that hasn't materialised. But we have been very aware that we've got to have that contingency in place if universities do find themselves in difficulty.
Thank you. Just on that, the support offered to my local university was for management consultants to come in and tell them how to manage, and to be given a 1-year loan, not a grant, which wasn't what they needed. They know how to manage their university, and they need a grant, not a loan, to cover the lost costs. So I hope that will be extended to something which suits them more and enables them to continue, because they've had to have major cuts to staff.
And you know, we do recognise that universities will have to restructure themselves in order to be able. Some universities will have to face restructure how what they offer, how they run, how they're managed as part of that. But you know, we've been clear that actually there is a regime where universities are in a place where they aren't going to be able to continue. We have a mechanism working with the Treasury as to how we manage those potential problems within the sector. And I think that's the right approach to do. But what we're wanting to do is avoid universities getting into that place. And that's why we put the other measures in terms of how we change for financing and the additional support for universities, including in terms of extra support through research that's helped so many universities.
Thank you. Fleur, are you okay?
That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Caroline, did I see your hand up, Caroline Johnson? No?
Specifically, no, sorry, thank you, Chair.
Okay, can I just ask, I've got one question for you, Secretary of State, and then just a couple for the Permanent Secretary, if I may. First of all, in terms of remote learning, is it your view that it's a mixture of interactive, live, and videos, or and how do you see the role of Ofsted in supporting schools, not necessarily as interrogators or investigators, but as candid friends, to work with schools and help schools, and also help spread best practice where some schools are maybe having difficulties for one reason or another?
Well, where we see remote learning, you often see it as a blend of different sort of different measures that are in place, including live lessons, which play an important role. But you know, obviously the setting of tasks, and we've put us so much information, and we've learned so much. Schools have learned so much, and has really driven the thinking of how this can be done best. And that's why we've been so clear in terms of setting out the expectations and the guidance that we've put there. I think Ofsted do play an important role, and actually you're right to say about supporting schools as well, supporting actually them to be the very best, get the very best for the pupils within that school. And Ofsted are taking a really positive approach in terms of how they're speaking with schools, how they're engaging with schools, and how they're supporting schools to get the very best. You know, the spring term monitoring inspection programme will focus on remote education in adequate schools, those with 2 or more requires improvement judgments, and some schools with a single requires improvement judgment. But obviously, you know, we want schools to be delivering the very best that they can do. And I think that most parents have seen what is being delivered in remote education by schools has changed significantly from March, April, May of last year.
Thank you. And if I could just ask the Permanent Secretary, one of the things that does put enormous pressure on education staff is when the department issues official guidance that then has errors or has to be changed. And I could go through numerous examples that I've written down here, but there have been significant number of occasions and highlighted on social media as well. So, for example, when it was announced the schools would be closed, the guidance for parents on the government website held that schools will remain open for critical workers, but guidance to schools stated that critical workers should keep their children at home if they can. There was different statements that put out about remote learning, different statements put about AP schools remaining open, different guidance and leaflets on mass asymptomatic testing in school and colleges and advising teachers and so on. And there's plenty of other examples where the profession understandably get very, very frustrated that different guidance is being set out, and also they often can't track changes. So my question to you is, to the Permanent Secretary, is what internal checks does the Department for Education have in place to verify the accuracy of information you are releasing during the pandemic? Because too often it's being changed or has errors, and who ultimately is signing off on this information?
Thank you, Chair. And the first thing I would say is I completely recognise that everybody is working under huge pressure in the pandemic, and if we get things wrong, that adds to the pressure. And so I'm sorry that that has happened.
Yeah, if you want to...
In terms of the checks that have gone through, we have a set of clearance gateways within the department for guidance, including we've now got a dedicated team that sits and looks at all the guidance together, having learned from experiences much earlier in the pandemic where we were asking different parts of the department to write the guidance and then finding that they didn't always entirely line up. So we've got a single central guidance team. It's cleared through the department, but it also goes through something called the triple lock process, which involves it going through number 10, the Cabinet Office, and also anything that is at all COVID related also goes through the Chief Medical Officer's system. So for us, it's usually Jenny Harries, the DCMO who specialises in education, who will clear the guidance, but she will personally look at every bit of guidance. And that's intended to make sure that we do line up our guidance with other bits across Whitehall.
So you can understand when the Secretary of State makes a statement that then different guidance is issued one after the other, confusing. I mean, this shouldn't be happening, really. And I mean, do you sign off these key parts of information yourself to check that they are correct?
So I don't sign off every bit of guidance that we issue, but it does go through it'll go through the relevant Director General, but also there's a clearance process inside the Secretary of State's office, as well as I say, the triple lock process across Whitehall. Sometimes it is the result of rapid movement in the situation and the policy. For example, on critical workers, it was true both that critical worker places were available and that we were asking critical workers not to take up the place if they didn't need it.
I think it's probably, yeah, I just think you need, I'm sure that you're sorting this out, but I just genuinely think it would make things a lot easier for the profession, given that the pressure that they are under, if these things didn't happen.
We are trying to take, I completely agree with you, and I take it very seriously. I think the other things that we've taken on board are the importance of trying to make sure we aren't putting out guidance late at night or short notice, and also that we are signalling clearly the changes. So the point that you make about teachers not always being able to spot the changes in guidance was made to us earlier in the term, and you will now see a section at the top of every bit of guidance we issue that lists the changes so that they don't have to.
Thank you. And just to understand the Greenwich advice, obviously you would have advised the Secretary of State about that, the Greenwich order. And were you aware when the order was issued to that on terms of the Greenwich schools, that the Secretary of State had announced in Parliament about the new variant?
The Secretary of State for Health?
Yes, sorry, I should have said Matthew Hancock, yeah.
So no, I don't think we were. I think that was the following day.
Okay, because I think it was the same day. So that's why I'm just trying to understand what went on at that time.
Okay, I mean, I'm very happy to check the record again. When we looked at the timeline in advance, I had thought that the Secretary of State for Health's announcement in Parliament was the following day, but no, we weren't aware of the announcement on the new variant at the point where the direction was issued.
Right. So would you have issued the variant? Would you have issued the order to Greenwich if you had known about the Secretary of State's statement about the new variant, the COVID variant?
The decision is obviously the Secretary of State's decision and not my decision. But I think that the reasons given by the Secretary of State earlier that Greenwich were acting unilaterally without discussion, and that we hadn't had public health advice that suggested that it was appropriate to close, and further that they weren't showing rates that I think there was something like 55th out of 151 lower tier local authority areas at the time. I think all of those would have continued to be significant factors in our consideration, even if.
And I absolutely understand that, and the Secretary of State wanted to keep the schools open. I just wanted to understand the decision-making process behind it. Secretary of State, thank you very much. Sorry, just to the Permanent Secretary, we've asked for the Chief Scientific Advisor of the DfE to come next week, and because we are having a session on public health and education, I'd very much appreciate if you could ensure that's facilitated, because we haven't yet I'm being told that is going to happen. This is for the Senior DfE Advisor.
What we're suggesting is that you have those advise us on health matters. So my chief scientific advisor is actually an economist, but we do have a doctor in the department, and as I say, we work very closely with Jenny Harries, who I think is also willing.
I think the committee's view is that we'd like the chief scientific advisor as well, if that's possible.
And I think it's for the minister to decide who's the best person in response to your request for someone to attend. So we'll work that through with the minister.
Okay, thank you. And Secretary of State, thank you for 3 grueling hours. It is really appreciated. Can I just confirm that you'll appear before the committee in sometime in the spring, in the early spring?
I'd be absolutely delighted to, as always, Robert. And also, if I take the opportunity, as I'm sure the whole committee would join me in also agreeing with me on this and sort of thanking the sector for the amazing work that they can do, whether it's in our nurseries, schools, colleges, universities, you know, tirelessly working to do the very best for all our children and showing the very best spirit and actually putting the interests of children first at every moment. And my gratitude is incredibly great, as I know the committee's is as well.
Yeah, I think the committee would say thank you to all at the DFE, including yourself, to try and keep schools open and to try and keep our children learning and to get schools open again, because that's what we all want as soon as possible. But thank you very much indeed, really appreciate it, and wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you, cheers.
Bye.
Macmillan Room. Macmillan Room.